Everyone remembers Moses as the man who stood before Pharaoh, lifted his staff over the sea, and led Israel out of slavery. He is one of the most recognizable figures in all of Scripture. His name is attached to plagues, commandments, wilderness miracles, and the birth of a nation. But before Moses became the leader of Israel, before Sinai, before the Exodus, before anyone in Egypt feared his return, his story passed through a place that many readers rush over too quickly. It passed through Midian. And in Midian, the Bible places a man beside him whose role is both quiet and startling. He is not an Israelite patriarch. He is not one of the elders of Egypt. He is not introduced as a prophet in Israel. He is introduced as Moses' father-in-law. His name is Jethro. That alone would be interesting enough. But Scripture does not leave Jethro in the background. He appears at critical moments. He receives Moses when Moses has nowhere else to go. He becomes the head of the household into which Moses enters. He is called a priest of Midian, and after the Exodus, after the sea has parted and Pharaoh's army has fallen, Moses still listens carefully when this same man speaks. So who was Jethro really? Why does the Bible preserve the memory of Moses' father-in-law so deliberately? Why is a priest from outside Israel allowed to stand so close to one of the central figures in the biblical story? And why, after all the wonders God performed in Egypt, does one of the most important leadership moments in Moses' life arrive through the counsel of this often forgotten man? Those questions matter because Jethro is not just a family detail. He is not there merely to fill out Moses' biography. The text gives us something more. It suggests that one of the greatest leaders in Scripture did not emerge fully formed from Pharaoh's court, or even from his first act of zeal in defending a Hebrew slave. Moses was shaped in obscurity. He was shaped in exile, and one of the hidden figures standing in that exile was Jethro. To understand why that matters, we have to begin where Moses' public greatness had not yet begun. We usually remember Moses at the height of his calling. We remember the burning bush, the confrontation with Pharaoh, and the voice that thundered from Sinai. But the Bible first brings us to a much more fragile version of Moses. Not the lawgiver, not the deliverer, not the leader of a nation. A fugitive. Moses had been raised in Pharaoh's household, positioned between two worlds. He was born a Hebrew, but he grew up amid the power and privilege of Egypt. Acts and Hebrews later help us see the tension in his story, but Exodus gives the turning point with painful simplicity. Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He intervened. He struck the Egyptian down. He hid the body in the sand. For a brief moment, it may have seemed as though Moses was acting decisively on behalf of his people. But the next day exposed a harder truth. He was not yet accepted as their deliverer, and his action had not remained secret. Suddenly, the man who had once lived near the center of Egyptian power was no longer secure in either world. Pharaoh sought to kill him. The Hebrew men did not respond to him as a recognized leader. Moses did not stand at the beginning of his triumph. He stood at the collapse of his old life. Then he fled. That small movement changes everything. Moses leaves Egypt behind, but he does not yet know what lies ahead. There is no crowd following him. No divine commission has been announced. No staff has become a sign. No sea has opened. The story that many people think they know has not really begun yet. Moses moves out into the wilderness not as a man stepping into destiny, but as a man escaping judgment. And that is the first detail most people miss. Moses did not begin as Israel's public hero. He disappeared. He vanished into the desert, into a region beyond the ordered power of Egypt, beyond the security of court life, beyond the familiar world that had shaped his first 40 years. In biblical storytelling, wilderness is often the place where identity is stripped down. It is where ambition fades, where self-confidence weakens, where survival replaces status. Egypt had given Moses education access and a view of power. The wilderness would give him something else. But before the wilderness became the place of his calling, it first became the place of his refuge. That is where Jethro's story begins to move toward him. Midian was not just a random location on Moses' journey. It was a real world with its own people customs and authority structures. The descendants of Midian are linked in Genesis to Abraham through Keturah, which means this region stands near Israel's story without being identical to it. Midian belonged to the wider world of desert roots, pastoral life, family clans, and survival beyond the river-fed stability of Egypt. This was not Pharaoh's world. This was a harder landscape, a place where water mattered, family bonds mattered, and local authority mattered. And in that world, the Bible introduces a household, not a palace, a household. That contrast is easy to miss, but it matters. Moses had come from the architecture of empire. He was about to enter the rhythms of a family in the land of Midian. The man at the center of that household was Jethro, later identified clearly as the priest of Midian. That title alone opens a door to the mystery. Jethro was not merely an aging father with daughters to protect. He held religious and social standing in his community. He occupied a position of weight. He belonged to the leadership structure of Midian in a way Moses did not. And that raises another question. When Moses arrived as a hunted outsider, why would a man like Jethro make room for him? The Bible does not answer that immediately. Instead, it slows down and places Moses at a well. That scene matters because wells in Scripture are rarely accidental. They are places of meeting, survival provision, and sometimes life-changing turns in a family story. Abraham's servant found Rebekah by a well. Jacob met Rachel by a well. Now Moses, exhausted and displaced, comes to a well in Midian. He sits down there with nothing that looks like the future people later imagined for him. No throne, no army, no audience, just need, uncertainty, and the silence of exile. What happens next will bring him into Jethro's orbit, but even before the meeting unfolds, the setup itself is already telling us something important. Moses is being moved from one identity into another. The man educated in Egypt is about to enter the household of a Midianite priest. The future deliverer of Israel is about to be received not as a prince, but as a stranger. The man who once knew the structures of imperial power is about to learn another kind of life entirely. That is why Jethro cannot be treated as a side note. If Moses' greatest public years begin in confrontation with Pharaoh, then his hidden years begin under the shadow of Midian. And if Midian becomes the place where Moses learns to live as something other than an Egyptian prince, then the head of the household in Midian becomes far more significant than many readers realize. Before Moses speaks to kings, he will live among shepherds. Before he carries the burden of a nation, he will carry the obscurity of exile. Before he stands as lawgiver, he will stand as a dependent man in another man's land. And before Jethro gives him counsel in the wilderness of Sinai, Jethro's world will first give him shelter. That is where this untold story truly begins. Not with Moses in power, but with Moses in flight. Not with the sea divided, but with a man sitting alone in a foreign land. Not with Israel gathered, but with one fugitive crossing into Midian, unaware that one of the most important hidden relationships of his life is about to begin. Because the next moment in the story will not bring Moses back to Egypt, it will bring him to the daughters of Jethro. Moses did not meet Jethro first, he met Jethro's daughters. The book of Exodus tells us that the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and that they came to draw water and fill the troughs for their father's flock. On the surface, it is a simple pastoral scene. But in the world Moses had just entered, water was not a background detail, it was survival. A well could become the center of conflict negotiation and control. And conflict arrives almost immediately. Shepherds come and drive the women away. Scripture does not tell us how often this happened. It does not describe the history between the daughters and the other shepherds. We are not told whether this was an ordinary abuse of power or a confrontation unique to that day. But we are told what Moses did. He stood up, he defended the women, then he watered their flock. It is one of the first important acts Moses performs after leaving Egypt, and there is a striking continuity in it. In Egypt, he had intervened when he saw a Hebrew being beaten. Then he attempted to intervene in a dispute between two Hebrews. Now in Midian, he sees vulnerable people being driven away from access to water, and once again, he steps between the stronger and the weaker. Moses' instinct to intervene has not disappeared, but the setting has changed. In Egypt, his intervention ended in death and exile. At the well, it ends with an invitation. That difference will change his life. When the daughters return home earlier than expected, their father notices. Exodus first identifies him here as Reuel. Later passages use the name Jethro for Moses' father-in-law, and still other texts introduce Hobab in a way that has produced centuries of discussion over exactly how these names and family relationships should be understood. We will return to that mystery later. For now, what matters is the father's response. He wants to know why his daughters have returned so quickly. They explain that an Egyptian rescued them from the shepherds and even drew water for the flock. Their description is revealing. They call Moses an Egyptian. That should not surprise us. He had been raised in Egypt. His clothing, manner, speech, or appearance may have marked him as Egyptian to people in Midian. Scripture does not tell us exactly what they noticed, so we should not pretend to know. But from their perspective, this stranger from the west belonged to Egypt. They had no reason yet to see him as the future prophet of Israel. They saw a foreign man who had helped them. Their father responds with hospitality. Why did they leave him at the well? Bring him here. Give him something to eat. And in that simple invitation, Moses' exile begins to change shape. He had fled from one household. Now another household opens its door. This is where the story of Jethro becomes more important than it first appears. Hospitality in the ancient world was not merely social politeness. In environments where travel could be dangerous and resources limited, receiving a stranger could mean the difference between vulnerability and protection. To enter a household was to come under a network of relationships, obligations, and provision. Moses had arrived in Midian disconnected from everything that once defined him. He had no obvious political protection, no recognized clan there, no army, no public calling, no position. And Jethro gave him a place. The biblical account is brief, but the consequence is enormous. Moses agrees to stay with the man. Then Jethro gives Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. A fugitive now becomes a husband. A stranger becomes connected to a household. A man who had lost his place in Egypt gains a new identity in Midian. This is not yet the Moses standing against Pharaoh. This is Moses settling down. That distinction matters, because when we already know the end of the story, it is easy to imagine that Moses spent every day in Midian waiting for God to send him back to Egypt. But Exodus does not describe his life that way. The text allows us to see a man building a new life. He marries, he has a son, he works, he tends the flock of his father-in-law. Years pass. The crisis in Egypt continues without him. From Moses' perspective, the future may have looked radically different from the one we know. Scripture does not tell us what Moses thought his life would become. We are not told whether he expected to remain in Midian permanently. We are not told whether he still dreamed of helping his people. We are not told whether he believed his failure in Egypt had permanently closed that chapter. So we should not invent his private thoughts. But we can observe what the story does tell us. Moses stays. And while he stays, Jethro becomes part of the structure of his life. That is the hidden relationship beginning to take form. To understand it, we need to look more closely at the man whose household Moses entered. Jethro is called a priest of Midian. That title immediately distinguishes him from the ordinary shepherds in the story. It suggests religious authority and likely social standing as well. But the Bible gives us very little information about the exact nature of his priesthood before Moses arrives. This is one of the places where responsible storytelling has to resist temptation. It would be easy to invent an entire theology for Jethro. It would be easy to declare exactly which gods he served, exactly what rituals he performed, or exactly what his beliefs were before encountering Moses. Scripture does not give us enough information to do that. What we can say is that he belonged to Midian, that he functioned as a priest, and that later, in Exodus, he responds to the deliverance of Israel in language that becomes extremely important. That later response raises questions about what Jethro believed and how his understanding developed. But at this stage, Scripture leaves the door open, and that uncertainty makes him more interesting, not less. Jethro stands close to Israel's story, while still coming from outside Israel. His connection to Moses is not based on ancestry within the 12 tribes. It is based on family hospitality experience and, eventually, counsel. This gives him a unique position. He is close enough to Moses to speak into his life, but distant enough from Israel's internal structure to see things from another perspective. That combination will matter enormously later. For now, however, Jethro's influence is quieter. Moses becomes a shepherd. That may sound like a minor occupational detail. It is not. The future leader of Israel spends years caring for another man's flock. Think about the reversal. Moses had been raised near the royal world of Egypt, one of the most organized civilizations of the ancient world. Egypt depended on hierarchy, administration, monumental power, and control of land and water. Now Moses works with sheep in a harsh landscape. A shepherd cannot command the environment. He must read it. He must know where water can be found. He must recognize danger. He must move slowly enough for the vulnerable. He must understand that a group can scatter. He must lead without the machinery of empire. This does not prove that every shepherding experience directly trained Moses for a specific later leadership skill. Scripture itself does not make that kind of detailed psychological argument. But the narrative contrast is difficult to ignore. Egypt had shown Moses one model of leadership. Midian exposed him to another. And Jethro's household stood at the center of that transition. The man who would later guide a nation through wilderness first learned to live in wilderness while tending the flock of his father-in-law. That is not a detail to rush past. It is one of the quiet ironies of Moses' life. Before he leads people through desert country, he spends years learning desert country. Before he becomes responsible for the survival of a nation, he becomes responsible for animals that depend on him for water and pasture. Before he carries the complaints of Israel, he lives within the ordinary demands of a family. Before he stands before God on the mountain, he works beneath the authority of another man. And that man is Jethro. There is another part of Moses' new life that deserves attention. Zipporah. She is often remembered because of one of the strangest episodes in Exodus, an incident we will need to treat carefully when her story intersects again with Moses' return to Egypt. But here at the beginning, Zipporah represents something even simpler. Moses now belongs to a family in Midian. Their first son is named Gershom. Exodus connects the name to Moses' experience of being a foreigner in another land. That idea captures the tension of these years perfectly. Moses has found a home, but he is still a stranger. He has a wife, but he is separated from his people. He has a family, But his Hebrew identity has not disappeared. He has safety, but Egypt remains behind him, unresolved. This is not an interruption in the Moses story. This is the Moses story. The years of obscurity are part of the formation of the man who will return, and Jethro is woven through those years. We should be careful not to exaggerate beyond the text. Scripture never says Jethro personally trained Moses to become the leader of Israel. It never gives us private conversations in which Jethro teaches Moses desert strategy. It never tells us that every leadership principle Moses later uses came from his father-in-law. Those claims would go too far. But Scripture does show us something concrete. Jethro gave Moses a household in which to live. Moses married into his family. Moses tended his flock. And later, when Moses faced a leadership problem so serious that Jethro believed it would wear him down, Jethro spoke into it directly. That later moment means the relationship established here cannot be dismissed as merely incidental. Trust had formed. Family bonds existed. Jethro had enough standing with Moses to observe him, challenge him, and be heard. But that moment is still years away. For now, Moses is living far from Egypt, and while Moses builds a life in Midian, the world he left behind continues to move. The king of Egypt dies. The Israelites groan under slavery. Their suffering rises before God. Then the biblical narrative shifts from political change to divine remembrance. God hears. God remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God sees. God knows. The Exodus story is about to accelerate, but notice where Moses is when the moment comes. He is not in a palace. He is not speaking to Hebrew elders. He is not preparing a rebellion. He is shepherding Jethro's flock. That is where Exodus 3 finds him. Moses leads the flock beyond the wilderness and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the ordinary day becomes something else entirely. A bush burns, but it is not consumed. Moses turns aside, and the fugitive shepherd hears his name called from the fire. Moses, Moses. The public story is about to begin. Yet even here, Jethro remains quietly present in the background. The flock belongs to him. The life Moses is about to leave is connected to him. The family Moses must now think about belongs to his household. The road back to Egypt will therefore require more than courage before Pharaoh. It will require Moses to leave the life he has built in Midian. And when Moses finally decides to return, one of the first men he must face is not Pharaoh. It is Jethro. That conversation will reveal something subtle about their relationship. Moses has received a calling from God, but before he walks back toward Egypt, he goes to his father-in-law and asks to leave. Moses had heard the voice from the burning bush. He had been told to return to Egypt. He had been given a mission that would place him before Pharaoh, before the elders of Israel, and eventually before an entire nation. But before Moses walked back into the land he had fled, he returned to Jethro. Exodus tells us that Moses went back to his father-in-law and asked permission to leave. The wording is easy to pass over. Moses did not simply disappear. He did not announce that a divine calling released him from every earthly responsibility. He approached the man whose household had received him. He asked to return to Egypt and see whether his relatives were still alive. And Jethro answered him simply, "Go in peace." Those few words reveal more than they seem to. They show that Moses' life in Midian had become real. This was not a temporary camp that Moses abandoned the moment something more important appeared. He had obligations. He had family ties. He had lived under Jethro's roof, married Jethro's daughter, tended Jethro's flock, and built years of ordinary life in Midian. Now that life had to be interrupted, and Jethro let him go. Scripture does not dramatize the conversation. It does not tell us whether Jethro understood everything Moses had experienced at the burning bush. It does not describe a long farewell. It does not tell us what questions Jethro may have asked. We should not invent them. But the text gives us enough to see trust. Moses speaks. Jethro releases him. No struggle is recorded. No attempt is made to hold him back. The man who once received a fugitive now allows that fugitive to leave as a husband, father, and man with a purpose beyond Midian. That is the first major transformation in their relationship. Jethro had given Moses a place when he had nowhere to go. Now he gives Moses freedom to leave. This is important because healthy influence is not always about holding someone close. Sometimes it is about recognizing when their road continues beyond you. Moses begins the journey toward Egypt. Zipporah travels with him. Their sons belong to this complicated intersection between Hebrew calling and Midianite family life. And then the narrative becomes strange. Very strange. On the journey, Exodus records one of the most difficult and debated episodes in Moses' life. At a lodging place, the Lord encounters him and seeks to put him to death. Zipporah takes a flint knife, circumcises her son, touches Moses with the foreskin, and speaks words that have puzzled readers for centuries. Then the threat passes. The scene is brief, its language is difficult, and the exact interpretation remains debated. Was Moses the one under direct threat? Was the problem the failure to circumcise his son? Why does Zipporah act rather than Moses? What exactly is meant by her statement about a bridegroom of blood? These questions have produced many interpretations, and Scripture does not answer every one of them explicitly. But one thing is unmistakable. Moses' Midianite family is now directly entangled with the covenant identity of the mission he is about to undertake. This is no longer just a private marriage in exile. The calling of Moses and the obligations surrounding the covenant cannot be separated from the household he has formed. That fact will matter later when Jethro reappears with Zipporah and Moses' sons. For now, the journey continues. Moses returns to Egypt. The man who fled for his life now walks back toward the empire that had once wanted him dead. But the Moses returning is not the same Moses who left. The change is not only spiritual, it is structural. When he fled Egypt, Moses was alone. Now he belongs to a family. When he fled, he had acted impulsively against one Egyptian oppressor. Now he carries a divine commission. When he fled, he had no recognized authority among the Hebrews. Now he is preparing to speak in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And behind this transformation lies a long period Scripture summarizes with remarkable restraint. Years in Midian, years in Jethro's world, years away from the courts of Egypt, years in which nothing outwardly looked like the beginning of the Exodus. That hidden period is one of the most important pieces of Moses' life, and yet it is also one of the least described. The Bible does not tell us what Moses and Jethro discussed around evening meals. It does not tell us whether they debated religion. It does not tell us whether Jethro taught Moses tribal customs, desert routes, dispute resolution, or the practical management of a large household. All of those things may be tempting to imagine, but the text does not say. So the stronger question is not what secret lessons did Jethro teach Moses. The stronger question is, what does Scripture actually allow us to see about the world Moses lived in before he became Israel's leader? And the answer is significant. Moses learned to exist outside Egypt. He learned the rhythm of wilderness life. He became attached to a family that did not originate within Israel. He worked as a shepherd. He lived under another man's authority. He became a husband. He became a father. He knew what it was to be a foreigner. Those are not speculative lessons. Those are elements the text itself gives us. and each one creates a striking contrast with the role Moses is about to assume. Because leading Israel out of Egypt will require more than courage. It will require endurance. It will require movement through wilderness. It will require navigating disputes. It will require dealing with hunger, fear, impatience, family structures, tribal identities, and constant pressure. Moses does not know yet how heavy that burden will become. Jethro will eventually see it before Moses sees it clearly enough himself. But that comes later. First comes Pharaoh. The confrontations begin. Moses and Aaron speak. Pharaoh resists. The burden on the Israelites increases before deliverance comes. Then the plagues strike Egypt. Water turns to blood. Frogs invade. Insects swarm. Disease spreads. Hail falls. Locusts consume. Darkness covers the land. And finally the night of Passover arrives. The firstborn of Egypt die. Pharaoh releases the Israelites, then changes his mind. The people are trapped between the sea and the Egyptian army. The moment becomes one of the defining images of the Bible. Moses stretches out his hand. The sea opens. Israel crosses. Egyptian forces pursue. The waters return. The people who had lived under forced labor now stand beyond Pharaoh's immediate reach. And from this point onward, Moses' name becomes permanently attached to the Exodus. But if we stop there, we miss Jethro's next entrance. Because while Israel is moving through the wilderness, word travels. News reaches Midian. Jethro hears. Exodus 18 opens by telling us that Jethro, priest of Midian, and Moses' father-in-law, heard what God had done for Moses and for Israel. He heard how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. That statement reconnects the two worlds. Moses had left Jethro's household as a shepherd returning toward danger. Now Jethro hears that the man who left Midian has become the leader of a delivered people. Imagine the reversal in status. Again, Scripture does not tell us Jethro's private emotions. We are not given a scene of him reacting in disbelief. But the objective change is dramatic enough. The fugitive he once welcomed is now at the center of an event shaking the region. The shepherd who tended his flock now leads a people through the wilderness, and the God associated with Moses has defeated the power of Pharaoh. Jethro does not merely hear the report and remain in Midian. He moves, and he brings something with him, Zipporah and Moses' sons. That detail raises an important question. At some point, Zipporah and the children had apparently returned to Jethro. Exodus 18 says that Moses had sent her away, but the text does not explain exactly when, why, or under what circumstances this happened. This is one of those biblical silences that should remain a silence. We should not create a marital crisis where the text does not describe one. We should not assume divorce. We should not invent conflict between Moses and Zipporah. The Hebrew expression has been interpreted in different ways, and the narrative gives us only the result. Zipporah and the sons are with Jethro when he comes to Moses. That fact alone is revealing. Jethro is still serving as a bridge between Moses' public mission and Moses' family life. The family that Moses formed in Midian has not disappeared simply because the Exodus has begun. It returns, and Jethro is the one bringing it back into the story. One son is Gershom, whose name remembers Moses' experience as a foreigner. The other is Eleazar, whose name is connected to Moses' confession that the God of his father had been his help and had delivered him from Pharaoh's sword. Even the names of the sons carry Moses' history: exile, deliverance, Midian, Egypt, family, calling. All of these worlds now converge in one wilderness camp. Jethro sends word ahead to Moses. He is coming. Your wife is with me. Your 2 sons are with her. Then Moses goes out to meet him. This meeting deserves attention because of the way Scripture describes it. Moses bows down. He kisses Jethro. They ask about one another's well-being. Then they enter the tent. The great leader of Israel receives his father-in-law with visible honor. That matters. At this stage in the story, Moses has stood before Pharaoh. He has witnessed the plagues. He has led Israel through the sea. He has already become the central human leader of the Exodus narrative, yet he does not treat Jethro as an irrelevant man from his former life. He bows. He welcomes him. The relationship still carries weight. And then Moses tells Jethro what has happened. He recounts what the Lord did to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake. He tells of the hardships encountered along the way. He tells how the Lord delivered them. For the first time, the relationship moves into a new phase. Years earlier, Moses had entered Jethro's household needing refuge. Now Jethro enters Moses' camp and hears the testimony of deliverance. The balance has changed, but respect remains. And Jethro responds in a way that has fascinated readers ever since. He rejoices. He blesses the Lord. He says that the Lord has delivered Israel from the hand of the Egyptians and from Pharaoh. Then he makes a remarkable declaration. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. What exactly does Jethro mean? Is this the confession of a converted man? Is it recognition of Yahweh's supremacy without a full abandonment of previous religious assumptions? Is this the culmination of a spiritual journey? Scripture only hints at. The text does not tell us enough to answer every part with certainty, but it does tell us what happens next. Jethro brings a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. Aaron comes, the elders of Israel come, and they eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Pause there. A priest of Midian is sitting with Aaron and the elders of Israel. The man many viewers barely remember is now participating in a sacred meal connected with Israel's God. That is one of the most remarkable scenes in Jethro's story. He begins as the father of women at a well. He becomes Moses' father-in-law. He receives Moses into his household. He watches Moses leave for Egypt. He later hears of Israel's deliverance. He comes into the wilderness. He blesses the Lord. He offers sacrifice, and he sits with Israel's leadership. This is the point where Jethro can no longer be described honestly as a mere supporting relative. He has entered the heart of the Exodus community. But the most consequential thing he will do has not happened yet. It happens the next morning. Jethro watches Moses work, and what he sees troubles him. The people stand around Moses from morning until evening. Case after case. Dispute after dispute. Question after question. One man carrying the weight of an entire people. To the Israelites, this may have seemed normal. Moses was their leader. He was the man through whom God had confronted Pharaoh. He was the man who spoke to them. He was the man they came to for judgment. But Jethro sees the same scene through different eyes. He watches. He assesses. Then he asks a question Moses may not have expected. What is this thing that you are doing to the people? That question will become the turning point of their relationship, because for the first time in the story, Jethro is not giving Moses shelter. He is about to give him correction. And Moses will have to decide whether the man who once received him as a fugitive still has something to teach the leader of Israel. The next morning, Jethro watches Moses sit before the people. From morning until evening, Israelites come to him with disputes. One case after another, one question after another, one conflict after another. The scene is easy to imagine at the level Scripture gives us. People wait. Moses listens. Decisions are made. More people arrive. The line continues. And Jethro sees a problem. Not a theological problem. Not a military problem. Not a rebellion. A leadership problem. That distinction is what makes Exodus 18 so unusual. The Exodus has already been filled with events of enormous scale. Egypt has been struck by plagues, the sea has opened, Israel has escaped slavery, water has come from rock, food has appeared in the wilderness. Then suddenly the biblical narrative pauses over something almost ordinary. Workload, administration, judgment, human limits. And the man who notices the danger is not Moses, it is Jethro. He asks Moses why he is sitting alone while all the people stand around him from morning until evening. Moses explains, the people come to him to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they bring it to him. Moses decides between one person and another, and he makes known God's statutes and instructions. There is logic in Moses' answer. He is not wasting time. He is not sitting there for personal glory. The people genuinely need judgment. They need guidance. They need someone capable of explaining what God requires. And Moses occupies a unique position. He has been called by God. He has confronted Pharaoh. He has become the primary human mediator between God and Israel in this stage of the story. So why should the people not come to him? Jethro's answer is direct. What you are doing is not good. That sentence is one of the great pattern interrupts in the life of Moses. Think about who is saying it. Not Pharaoh, not an enemy, not a rebellious Israelite, not Aaron, not one of the elders. Moses' father-in-law, the priest of Midian. The man who once received Moses when Moses had no place to go now looks at Israel's deliverer and tells him that his current way of leading cannot continue. Jethro explains why. Moses will wear himself out, and the people will wear themselves out too. The task is too heavy for one man to carry alone. That observation changes how we should read the scene. At first glance, Moses' constant availability may look admirable. One leader personally hearing every dispute, one man taking responsibility, one man refusing to delegate what matters. But Jethro sees the hidden cost. A system can appear devoted while still being unsustainable. A leader can appear indispensable while actually becoming a bottleneck. The issue is not merely that Moses is tired, the people are affected as well. If every case must reach one man, then everyone waits for one man. If every judgment depends on one human channel, then the community becomes limited by that person's capacity. Jethro sees something that victory over Pharaoh did not automatically solve. Israel has been delivered from slavery, but a delivered people still needs structure. That is the detail many readers remember vaguely, but rarely stop to consider. The Exodus did not end Israel's problems. It changed the kind of problems Israel faced. Under Pharaoh, the crisis was oppression. Outside Egypt, the crisis becomes organization. How do former slaves become a functioning community? How are disputes handled? How is authority distributed? How does one leader avoid becoming responsible for every conflict in a population? Miracles can bring a people out of Egypt, but daily life still has to be governed, and Jethro steps directly into that gap. His counsel is practical. Moses should continue to represent the people before God. He should continue to teach them the statutes and instructions. He should show them the way they are to live and the work they are to do. Jethro is not telling Moses to abandon his calling. He is telling Moses to distinguish between what only Moses must do and what others can responsibly share. That distinction is the heart of the advice. Teach the people, represent them before God, but do not personally decide every case. Instead, select capable men from among the people. Men who fear God, men who are trustworthy, men who hate dishonest gain. Place them over groups, thousands, hundreds, 50s, 10s. Let them judge ordinary cases. Let the difficult cases come to Moses. The burden will be shared. The people will be able to return home in peace. This is not merely a suggestion to get help. It is a structure, a layered structure. And that is why the scene is so important. Jethro sees that Moses' problem cannot be solved by working harder. It has to be solved by leading differently. There is also something deeply significant about the qualifications Jethro emphasizes. He does not say, choose the most impressive men. He does not say, choose the wealthiest. He does not say, choose men who flatter you. He points to character, capability, fear of God, reliability, resistance to corrupt gain. The problem is administrative, but the solution is moral as well as organizational. Authority must be distributed, but it cannot be distributed carelessly. This creates one of the most important micro payoffs in Jethro's story. Why does Scripture preserve his advice? Because the advice is not trivial. It addresses the moment when Moses' leadership model begins to shift from one-man response to shared responsibility. And then comes a sentence that deserves just as much attention as Jethro's counsel. Moses listens. Exodus says that Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. That may be the most revealing line in the entire relationship. Moses has already seen signs and wonders. He has stood before Pharaoh repeatedly. He has become the recognized leader of Israel. Yet he remains capable of receiving correction from an older man outside Israel's formal leadership structure. That is not weakness. It is part of what makes the scene work. Jethro's wisdom would have meant very little if Moses were too proud to hear it. So this episode reveals two men at once. It reveals Jethro as perceptive enough to identify a dangerous system, and it reveals Moses as teachable enough to change it. The relationship has now come full circle. At the beginning, Moses needed Jethro's household. Now Moses needs Jethro's perspective. At the beginning, Jethro gave Moses a place to stay. Now he gives Moses a way to survive leadership. At the beginning, Moses was powerless. Now he is powerful. Yet the relationship still carries enough trust for Jethro to say, in effect, this cannot continue. That is the midpoint revelation. Jethro matters not because Scripture gives him hundreds of verses. Jethro matters because of where he appears. He appears at transition points. When Moses loses one life and needs another, Jethro's household receives him. When Moses leaves Midian for Egypt, Jethro releases him. When Moses' family needs to reconnect with him, Jethro brings them. When Moses is drowning under the administrative weight of leadership, Jethro sees the problem. Jethro's story is a story of strategic presence. He appears when Moses is crossing from one stage of life into another. That pattern is more significant than the number of verses devoted to him. The Bible sometimes gives very little space to people who nevertheless stand at critical intersections. Jethro is one of them. But this raises another question. Where did his insight come from? Was this simply the practical wisdom of an experienced tribal leader? Was it connected to his role as priest? Was Jethro drawing on administrative patterns common in his world? Was this counsel entirely new to Moses, or did it put into structure something Moses already sensed? The text does not tell us, and that silence matters. We should not turn Jethro into the secret founder of Israel's entire legal system. That would go beyond Scripture. The law given through Moses does not originate in Jethro. The covenant at Sinai does not come from Jethro. Moses' divine calling does not come from Jethro. Jethro himself frames his counsel conditionally, acknowledging God's authority over whether the plan should be followed. His role is not to replace revelation. His role is to recognize a practical danger in the way Moses is carrying responsibility. This boundary keeps the story credible. Jethro is important precisely without needing to make him more than the text allows. He does not have to be the hidden author of Moses' mission. his actual contribution is already remarkable. But there is another detail here that becomes even more interesting when we look at where the story sits. Exodus 18 comes immediately before Israel reaches one of the most consequential moments in the entire Old Testament narrative. Sinai, the mountain, the covenant, the commandments. Israel is about to move from a delivered population toward an explicitly covenant-ordered people. Before that happens, the narrative shows Moses learning not to carry every judicial responsibility alone. Whether the arrangement of Exodus 18 is meant primarily as strict chronological sequencing or also serves a literary function has been discussed by interpreters. But in the form of the book as we have it, the effect is striking. First, Moses learns to distribute responsibility. Then the narrative moves towards Sinai. The sequence forces us to recognize something easily lost beneath the spectacle. A nation requires more than a leader. It requires trustworthy people capable of carrying responsibility within the community. That idea will continue far beyond Jethro. Later biblical history will be filled with elders, judges, officials, priests, tribal leaders, commanders, and local authorities. Jethro's advice is not the entire origin story of all those roles, but Exodus preserves this moment as an early and vivid example of distributed judgment around Moses. And the man who sees the need comes from Midian. That is the contradiction at the center of Jethro's importance. Israel's leader receives valuable leadership counsel from outside Israel. The man who speaks is identified as a priest of Midian. He is not portrayed as a rival. He is not mocked. His foreign background does not prevent the narrative from presenting his observation as wise. Moses evaluates it. Then he acts on it. That alone should make us careful with simplistic ideas about minor characters in Scripture. Sometimes the outsider sees what the insider has stopped noticing. Sometimes the person without the central title recognizes the central problem. And sometimes the most useful question is not spoken by the most famous person in the room. What you are doing is not good. Jethro says it. Moses listens. The system changes, but even now there is another layer to the story. Jethro's counsel is often treated as the climax of his biography. In one sense it is. This is his most famous contribution. But if we stop here, several mysteries remain unresolved. Who exactly was this man? Why does Exodus first call Moses' father-in-law Reuel, later use Jethro, and elsewhere introduce Hobab into the family relationship? What does priest of Midian really tell us about him? And perhaps most intriguingly, what are we supposed to make of the religious confession he made after hearing about the Exodus? Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. Those words sound powerful, but how far should we take them? Some readers have treated Jethro as a convert to the worship of Israel's God. Others have been more cautious. Later Jewish and Christian traditions expand his story dramatically. Some traditions make him far more important than the biblical text itself does. Others try to fill the silence after his departure. This is where the untold story becomes dangerous if handled carelessly. Because Jethro is surrounded by exactly the kind of gaps that invite speculation. Several names, a foreign priesthood, a dramatic confession, a sacrifice, a connection to later Kenite groups, a departure from the narrative, and very little explanation. The temptation is to fill every blank. But the better approach is to leave the blanks visible. Scripture gives us enough to see Jethro's significance. It does not give us enough to construct a complete biography. That difference will become crucial. After Jethro's advice has been implemented, Exodus says that Moses let his father-in-law depart. Jethro went back to his own land. The statement is abrupt. No grand farewell, no death scene, no final prophecy. No summary of his remaining years. The man who has just changed the rhythm of Moses' leadership simply leaves. And in that departure, the Bible creates another mystery. Jethro disappears from the central Exodus story almost as quietly as he entered it. Yet his family connections do not vanish so easily. Later passages introduce names and groups associated with Moses' Midianite relatives. One of those names is Hobab, another is Reuel. Later still, the Kenites appear in Israel's story, and suddenly the apparently simple question, who was Moses' father-in-law, becomes much less simple than it first sounded. To understand what we actually know about Jethro, we now have to do something the story has deliberately postponed. We have to separate what Scripture clearly says from what it leaves uncertain. And when we do, we will discover that the mystery of Jethro is not merely about a missing biography. It is about identity. Because the man called Moses' father-in-law may be one of the clearest examples of how a few biblical names can generate a very large question. By the time Jethro leaves the camp, Moses has already changed, not in the dramatic way viewers usually associate with his story. No sea opens, no mountain shakes, no plague falls, no staff becomes a serpent. The change is quieter. Moses stops trying to carry everything himself. That may sound like a small administrative correction compared with the spectacle of the Exodus, but in the life of a leader, structure can determine survival. Jethro had seen what Moses could not continue doing, and Moses listened. Capable men were chosen, responsibility was distributed, ordinary cases could be handled at lower levels. Only the most difficult matters needed to rise to Moses. The burden was no longer resting on one set of shoulders. This is where Jethro's contribution begins producing consequences larger than the original conversation. Because the issue was never just Moses' exhaustion, it was the future of the people. Israel was no longer a cluster of families living under Egyptian oppression. They were becoming a mobile community in the wilderness. Their lives now required decisions about disputes, property, responsibility, behavior, worship, movement, and authority. A people can be liberated in a single night. A community cannot be organized in a single night. That takes structure, and Jethro had recognized the need for structure before the full weight of Sinai had even unfolded. This does not mean Jethro created Israel's law. He did not. The commandments, covenant requirements, and larger legal material in Exodus are presented as coming from God through Moses. Jethro's role is different. He helps Moses think about how responsibility should be carried. That distinction is essential. Jethro does not replace divine revelation. He addresses human limitation. And the difference between those two things may explain why his advice remains so memorable. Even a divinely called leader is still human. Even the man who speaks with God cannot personally stand at the center of every dispute. Even sacred responsibility has practical limits. The Bible does not portray Moses as less important because he delegates. It portrays delegation as necessary. That is an important reversal. Some readers imagine strong leadership as controlling everything. Jethro sees strength differently. Strong leadership means knowing what only you can do, and knowing what others must be allowed to carry. That principle becomes one of the clearest character payoffs in the Jethro story. But now the story shifts, because once Jethro's advice has been received, the biblical text becomes unexpectedly quiet about him. He returns to his own land, and this creates a strange narrative effect. A man who has stood close to Moses at several decisive moments is suddenly gone. He had been there when Moses needed refuge. He had been connected to Moses' marriage. He had been the owner of the flock Moses tended. He had witnessed the consequences of the Exodus. He had blessed the Lord. He had offered sacrifice. He had sat with Aaron and the elders. He had corrected Moses. Then he departs. No final speech, no recorded death, no detailed genealogy, no explanation of his later years. For a character who mattered this much, the silence feels almost abrupt, and that silence pushes us toward another part of the mystery. Jethro may disappear from the main narrative, but Moses' Midianite family connections do not. The book of Numbers introduces another scene. Israel has been moving through the wilderness. The people are preparing to depart from the mountain region. Moses speaks to a man named Hobab. The text identifies Hobab in relation to Reuel the Midianite and to Moses' family by marriage. This passage has become one of the central reasons the identity of Moses' father-in-law is debated. Depending on how the Hebrew kinship term is understood, and how the names are related across Exodus and Numbers, interpreters have proposed several possibilities. Perhaps Jethro and Reuel refer to the same individual under different names or titles. Perhaps Reuel was the older patriarch and Jethro another family member. Perhaps Hobab was Moses' brother-in-law rather than his father-in-law. Different translations sometimes reflect different interpretive decisions. The important thing is not to pretend the problem does not exist. It does. But it is equally important not to let the name puzzle swallow the story. Whatever precise reconstruction we adopt, Scripture clearly preserves an ongoing relationship between Moses and a Midianite family connected by marriage. And in Numbers, that relationship becomes practical again. Moses asks Hobab to travel with Israel. Why? Because Hobab knows the wilderness. Moses tells him, in effect, that he knows where Israel should camp and can serve as eyes for them. That is a remarkable request. The man who has followed the pillar of cloud still values human knowledge of terrain. Divine guidance and practical experience are not presented as enemies. Israel can trust God and still benefit from someone who knows the land. This echoes the logic of Jethro's earlier advice. God's presence does not eliminate the value of human wisdom. God's calling does not make experience irrelevant. Moses has learned to receive help. That may be one of the most important consequences of Jethro's influence. Earlier, Moses had tried to judge everything alone. Now we see a leader willing to recognize what another person knows. The pattern has changed, and perhaps that is one of the less obvious ways Jethro's story continues after Jethro himself leaves the stage. The issue is no longer simply, what did Jethro tell Moses? The deeper issue is, what kind of leader is Moses becoming? A leader who can listen, a leader who can distribute responsibility, a leader who can recognize expertise outside himself, a leader who does not confuse divine calling with personal sufficiency. That is a much larger consequence, and it becomes even more significant when we remember where Moses began. In Egypt, Moses saw injustice and acted alone. He struck the Egyptian. He buried the body. His intervention was immediate, personal, and unilateral. Then he attempted to intervene again between two Hebrews. He was rejected. He fled. Years later, after Midian and Jethro, Moses still carries enormous authority, but his relationship to authority has become more complex. He listens to Aaron. He works with elders. He receives Jethro's counsel. He appoints leaders. He recognizes the need for others. This does not mean Jethro single-handedly produced all of these changes. The Bible does not say that. Moses' formation includes his encounters with God, his experiences in Egypt, the wilderness, Israel's repeated crises, and many other relationships. But Jethro occupies a distinct place inside that formation. He is one of the few people in the narrative who can confront Moses constructively without being portrayed as rebellious. That is unusual. When many Israelites challenge Moses, the challenge comes from distrust, resentment, jealousy, or open rebellion. Jethro's correction is different. He is not trying to remove Moses. He is trying to preserve him. He does not say, "You should not lead." He says, in effect, "You cannot lead this way." That is the difference between opposition and counsel. And Moses seems to recognize it. This becomes especially important as pressure increases. The wilderness will test Moses repeatedly. The people complain about food. They complain about water. They fear enemies. They question leadership. They look backward toward Egypt. Even Moses eventually reaches moments of deep frustration. The burden of leadership is not theoretical. It becomes emotional, spiritual, and physical. One later episode in Numbers shows Moses overwhelmed by the weight of the people. He tells God that the burden is too heavy for him alone. God responds by appointing 70 elders to share the burden. That later scene is not identical to Jethro's administrative counsel in Exodus 18. The contexts differ, and we should not collapse them into one event. But the thematic echo is difficult to miss. Again, the problem is one man carrying too much. Again, the answer involves shared responsibility. Again, Scripture refuses the idea that faithful leadership requires solitary leadership. Jethro had seen that danger early. That gives his advice an almost prophetic, practical quality, even though Scripture never calls him a prophet. He looked at Moses and saw a future problem already beginning. Weariness, congestion, dependence on one person, and he responded before collapse. That is why his story changes the way we read Moses. The great leader of Israel did not simply give wisdom. He received it. And he received some of it from a man standing outside Israel's central covenant line. This is one of the uncomfortable surprises of Jethro's story. The Bible does not appear embarrassed by it. It does not minimize him because he is Midianite. It does not erase his priestly title. It preserves it. Priest of Midian. The words remain attached to him. That title has generated another major question. What kind of priest was Jethro, and how should we understand his relationship to the God of Israel? This is where later interpretation often runs ahead of the biblical evidence. Some traditions portray Jethro as a pagan priest who rejected idolatry and eventually joined himself fully to the God of Israel. Some make his spiritual journey highly elaborate. Others connect him with broader theories about the origins of Yahweh worship in the southern regions of Midian and Edom. Modern scholarship has even discussed versions of what is sometimes called the Midianite or Kenite hypothesis, which explores whether early Israelite knowledge of Yahweh may have had historical connections with southern groups related to Midian. These are real scholarly discussions. But they must not be confused with what Exodus itself explicitly says. Exodus never tells us that Moses first learned the name Yahweh from Jethro. It does not tell us Jethro created Israel's religion. It does not say Jethro was the source of Moses' revelation. The burning bush narrative places the divine call squarely with God. Any attempt to make Jethro the secret origin of Israel's faith goes far beyond the biblical text. What Exodus does give us is both simpler and more interesting. Jethro hears what the Lord has done. He rejoices. He blesses the Lord. He declares the Lord greater than all gods. He offers sacrifice. Then he shares a meal with Aaron and the elders before God. Those are substantial details. The question is what they mean. His statement, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods," can be understood as a strong confession of Yahweh's prosperity. But does it mean Jethro now embraces exclusive worship of Yahweh? The text does not explicitly tell us. Ancient religious language could acknowledge the greatness of one deity without necessarily denying the existence of all others. On the other hand, Jethro's sacrifice and participation with Israel's leaders suggest more than casual admiration. The safest conclusion is that Exodus presents a genuine and favorable response to Yahweh's acts. How far that response developed afterward remains unknown. And this is exactly where uncertainty becomes part of the story rather than a weakness in it. We do not need to know everything about Jethro for his significance to become clear. In fact, the gaps may help us see the text more carefully. Jethro is preserved through actions. He receives, he gives, he listens, he rejoices, he blesses, he advises, he leaves. The Bible does not give us his autobiography. It gives us his impact. That difference matters. Some of Scripture's most consequential characters are defined less by the amount of information we have about them than by what happens when they enter the story. Jethro is one of those people, but the consequences extend even beyond Moses' leadership style. Later biblical texts preserve the memory of groups connected with Moses' Midianite family. The Kenites are especially interesting. Judges refers to descendants or relatives linked with Moses' father-in-law. One passage says that the descendants of the Kenite Moses' father-in-law went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness. Another introduces Heber the Kenite as having separated from the other Kenites, whose ancestry is again linked to Moses' family connection. This suggests that the relationship formed in Midian did not vanish when Moses died. Some family or clan connection continued into Israel's later history. And then the story takes an unexpected turn. In the period of the Judges, a Kenite woman named Jael becomes one of the most memorable women in the book. She kills Sisera, commander of the Canaanite army, after he flees from battle. The connection should be handled carefully. The biblical text links the Kenites with Moses' father-in-law, but reconstructing a simple direct family line from Jethro to every later Kenite individual would go beyond what we can prove. Still, the narrative connection is real enough to notice. The family network surrounding Moses' Midianite marriage continues appearing long after Jethro's own final scene. That means Jethro's legacy cannot be reduced to one piece of management advice. His household becomes connected with Israel. His relatives remain near Israel's story. His wisdom shapes Moses. His daughter is Moses' wife. His grandchildren are Moses' sons, and his clan connections appear generations later. The foreign household that sheltered Moses never becomes completely irrelevant to Israel. That is the consequence. But now another question becomes unavoidable. If Jethro's influence was this extensive, why is he remembered so vaguely? Why do so many readers know Moses, Zipporah, Aaron, Miriam, Joshua, and Pharaoh, yet barely remember the priest who received Moses into his family? Part of the answer is narrative perspective. Jethro is not the central figure. Scripture does not follow him after he leaves. His purpose in Exodus is tied primarily to Moses and Israel. When that role is complete, the camera of the narrative moves elsewhere. But that does not make him unimportant. It makes him hidden. And hidden influence is precisely the kind of influence that becomes easy to forget. Jethro never becomes Israel's public leader. He never stands before Pharaoh. He never climbs Sinai to receive the covenant. He never commands Israel's armies. He never succeeds Moses. He does not need to. His contribution happens one step behind the famous story. He gives refuge before Moses is known. He gives family before Moses leads a nation. He gives counsel after Moses becomes powerful. Then he leaves. There is something almost fitting about that pattern. Jethro does not try to become the center of Moses' story, and Scripture does not force him into the center either. His significance is measured by consequence rather than spotlight. That may be the real turning point of the untold story. The question is no longer whether Jethro mattered. He clearly did. The remaining question is how far we can go in defining who he was. Because from this point onward, the evidence becomes more complicated. Reuel, Jethro, Hobab, Midianites, Kenites, priesthood, sacrifice, later tradition, scholarly theories. The pieces can be assembled in several ways, but not every reconstruction deserves the same confidence. So before reaching the final answer about Jethro, we have to enter the most delicate part of the story. The place where Scripture speaks, the place where history may help, and the place where both become silent. Jethro's story becomes most interesting exactly where certainty begins to weaken. Up to this point, the broad outline is clear. Moses fled Egypt. He entered Midian. He became connected to a priestly household. He married Zipporah. He tended the flock of his father-in-law. Years later, that same father-in-law came to Moses after the Exodus, blessed the Lord-offered sacrifice, and gave advice that changed the way Moses handled leadership. Those facts are secure within the biblical narrative. But the closer we look at Jethro's identity, the more complicated the picture becomes. The first difficulty is his name. In Exodus 2, the father of the 7 daughters is called Reuel. Later, the man clearly identified as Moses' father-in-law is called Jethro. Then Numbers 10 introduces Hobab, linked to Reuel the Midianite and to Moses through a family relationship that different translations sometimes rendered differently. That creates an obvious question. Are Reuel and Jethro the same person? Is Jethro a title and Reuel a personal name? Was Reuel the head of the wider household, while Jethro was another close relative? Was Hobab the brother of Zipporah? Or is Hobab himself another designation for Moses' father-in-law? The biblical text does not stop to explain the naming problem for us. That is important. Sometimes readers assume that every apparent tension must have a simple solution if we only search long enough. But responsible interpretation begins by admitting what the text does not explicitly resolve. Several explanations are possible. None should be presented as though Scripture itself spells it out. One possibility is that a single individual could have been known by more than one name or title. That is not unusual in biblical literature. People can carry personal names, titles, nicknames, or alternative names. If that is what is happening here, then Reuel and Jethro may refer to the same man. Another possibility is that Reuel refers to an older patriarch of the family, while Jethro and Hobab belong to a younger generation. Kinship terminology in ancient texts can also be broader than modern English categories suggest. A word translated as father-in-law in one context may be rendered more generally as relative by marriage in another. This is why translations sometimes differ, and those differences matter, not because one translation is necessarily trying to hide something, but because translators must make choices when ancient kinship language allows more than one reasonable reading, so the evidence boundary must remain visible. What can we say with confidence? Moses married into a Midianite family. That family was connected with a priestly figure. The names Reuel, Jethro, and Hobab appear within that family network. Later biblical texts preserve a connection between Moses' relatives by marriage and the Kenites. What can we not say with equal confidence? We cannot reconstruct the entire family tree without debate. We cannot prove with absolute certainty that every name refers to the same person. And we should not build the central message of the story on a solution the text itself leaves uncertain. That may sound less dramatic, but it actually gives us a better mystery, because the untold story of Jethro is not strengthened by pretending every gap has been solved. It is strengthened by recognizing what remains open. The second major question is Jethro's religion. He is called a priest of Midian. That title tells us something important but incomplete. A priest is not simply a shepherd. A priest occupies a religious function. But Exodus does not explain Jethro's theology before Moses arrived. It does not name the deity or deities he may have served. It does not describe a temple shrine altar system or priestly hierarchy associated with him. That silence has invited many reconstructions. Some later traditions portray Jethro as a man who had already rejected idolatry before Moses entered his household. Others present his encounter with the story of the Exodus as the decisive turning point in his faith. Still others place him inside larger theories about the religious history of the southern desert regions. But the Bible itself gives us only a few direct pieces of evidence. The most important comes in Exodus 18. Jethro hears what the Lord has done to Egypt. He rejoices over Israel's deliverance. He blesses the Lord. He declares that the Lord is greater than all gods. Then he brings a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. Aaron and the elders eat with him before God. That is the biblical evidence. Now comes the interpretation. Does this mean Jethro became a full convert to the exclusive worship of Yahweh? Possibly. Many readers have understood the passage that way. His words and actions are unquestionably favorable. The narrative does not portray him as a religious enemy. It portrays him as responding positively to the Lord's deliverance. But there is a difference between saying the text presents a genuine acknowledgement of Yahweh and saying the text gives us Jethro's complete later theology. It does not. His words may express exclusive commitment, or they may reflect the kind of language in which one deity is recognized as supreme over others. The text does not continue long enough to settle the question. Again, the boundary matters. Scripture states his confession. Interpretation asks how far that confession extends. Tradition goes further still. And tradition must be labeled as tradition. Later Jewish literature developed Jethro into a much fuller character than the biblical narrative does. In some stories he is associated with Pharaoh's court. In others he is portrayed as rejecting idolatry and suffering social consequences. Some traditions imagine conversation motives and spiritual developments that are simply absent from Exodus. These traditions can be fascinating. They tell us how later communities remembered and expanded the figure of Jethro. But they do not carry the same authority as the biblical text. They cannot be used to fill biblical silence and then presented as though Moses himself recorded those details. That rule becomes especially important in a story like this because Jethro invites expansion. He is exactly the sort of character later imagination loves. A mysterious priest, a father-in-law of Moses, a man from outside Israel, a man who blesses Israel's God, a man who gives wise counsel, a man who disappears. That combination naturally creates legends. But legends are not the same as Scripture, and the stronger the story becomes, the more careful the distinction must be. There is also a historical question surrounding Midian itself. Who were the Midianites? Genesis connects Midian to Abraham through Keturah. Later biblical texts present Midianites in a variety of ways. Sometimes they appear as trading peoples, sometimes as allies or relatives, sometimes as enemies. Much later in the period of the Judges, Midian becomes one of Israel's great oppressors until Gideon's victory. That later hostility can make Jethro's presence in Exodus seem surprising. A Midianite priest is helping Moses. Later Midianites fight Israel. But this is not necessarily a contradiction. Ancient peoples were not monolithic. Tribal confederations could be complex. Relationships could change across generations. Some clans could be friendly, while others were hostile. Political alliances could shift. The Bible itself preserves both positive and negative relationships connected with Midianite and Kenite groups. That complexity should warn us against turning ethnic labels into simple moral categories. Jethro is not portrayed negatively because he is Midianite. His actions are evaluated by what he does. And what he does in Exodus is consistently favorable toward Moses. That leads to one of the most interesting, larger discussions surrounding Jethro. Some scholars have argued that Moses' connection to Midian may preserve a historical memory of Yahweh worship in southern regions associated with Midian, Edom, Seir, or Teman. This family of ideas is often associated with what is called the Midianite-Kenite hypothesis. The exact forms of the theory vary. Some suggest that knowledge of Yahweh may have been connected with southern groups. before becoming central in Israel's national worship. Jethro, as a priest of Midian, therefore becomes important in discussions about the historical origins of Israelite religion. This is a serious area of scholarly debate, but it is not something the biblical text itself directly teaches. We have to keep those levels separate. The Bible presents God as revealing himself to Moses. The burning bush scene does not portray Jethro as introducing Moses to Yahweh. Exodus does not say Jethro taught Moses the name of Israel's God. That claim would go beyond the narrative. Historical theories can ask broader questions. They can compare geographical traditions. They can study names, poetic passages, and regional associations. But none of that should be smuggled back into the biblical story as though Exodus explicitly says it. This is exactly what evidence boundaries are for. Scripture, inference, history, tradition, unknown. 4 different levels, and Jethro touches all 4. Scripture tells us he existed within Moses' family network and served as priest of Midian. Inference allows us to recognize that such a role likely gave him significant standing and experience. History can help us understand the wider world of Midian tribal leadership, pastoral life, and southern desert geography. Tradition can show how later communities expanded his character, and the unknown remains larger than many people expect. We do not know when Jethro was born. We do not know how he became a priest. We do not know exactly what his priesthood involved before Exodus 18. We do not know all the details of his family tree. We do not know how old he was when Moses arrived. We do not know every belief he held. We do not know how long he lived after leaving Moses. We do not know the circumstances of his death. We do not know whether he ever physically joined Israel permanently. We do not know every way his descendants or clan connections continued. The Bible simply does not tell us. And this is where the story becomes more meaningful, because Jethro's importance does not depend on knowing his entire life. Scripture often works this way. It gives us enough to understand significance without satisfying every curiosity. We know what Jethro did. We know where he entered Moses' life. We know how Moses responded to him. We know the consequences of his counsel. The absence of a complete biography does not erase those facts. It focuses them, and one of the strongest pieces of evidence is still the scene in Exodus 18. Jethro watches Moses judge the people. Jethro identifies the problem. Jethro proposes a system. Moses listens. That sequence is not disputed by the name problem. It is not erased by uncertainty over Jethro's theology. It is not dependent on later tradition. It stands directly in the narrative. That means the central mystery is beginning to narrow. Who was Jethro? We may never be able to reconstruct every dimension of his identity, but why does he matter? That answer is becoming clearer. He is one of the few people in Moses' life who appears before and after Moses becomes famous. He knew Moses when Moses was a fugitive. He knew him as a husband. He knew him as a shepherd. He knew him before Pharaoh. Then he met him again after Pharaoh. That gives Jethro a perspective almost nobody else has. Aaron knew Moses as a brother. Miriam knew him from childhood. The Israelites knew him as deliverer. Pharaoh knew him as an adversary. Joshua would know him as leader and mentor. But Jethro knew both versions. Moses before the mission, and Moses inside the burden. That may explain why his criticism carries such weight. Jethro is not impressed by the public image. He remembers the man. He can look at the leader of Israel and still see a human being who can be exhausted. That is a powerful relationship. And it makes his advice more than administrative. It becomes personal. You will surely wear yourself out. The language is about sustainability. Jethro does not merely see an inefficient system. He sees a man being consumed by it, and he sees the people suffering under it too. That combination gives his counsel its force. A less trusted man might have sounded insulting. A less experienced man might have been ignored. A rival might have been suspected. But Jethro occupies a unique place. He is family. He is older. He is outside the immediate political structure. He has religious standing. He has already demonstrated goodwill, and he speaks plainly. Moses listens. That may be the most historically important thing we can say about Jethro without speculation. He was trusted enough to receive Moses, trusted enough to become family, trusted enough to bring Moses' wife and sons back to him, trusted enough to challenge his leadership, trusted enough to be obeyed. That is not a minor role. Now the story is ready for its main payoff. But before we reach it, one more contrast must be seen clearly. Moses is the man associated with divine revelation. Jethro is the man associated with practical observation. Moses hears from God. Jethro watches the people. Moses carries the mission. Jethro notices the strain. Moses understands the divine responsibility. Jethro recognizes the human limit. The two forms of insight meet in Exodus 18, and neither is presented as unnecessary. That is why the episode survives, not because Jethro becomes greater than Moses. He does not. Not because Jethro becomes the hidden source of Israel's faith. The text never says that. Not because the entire government of Israel can be traced to one Midianite priest. That claim would be too large. The significance is more precise. Moses had been called to lead, but being called did not mean he had to carry everything alone. Jethro saw that, and Moses accepted it. The famous story belongs to Moses, but one of the decisions that helped Moses survive the story came from someone standing just outside the spotlight. That is Jethro's place. And in the next stage, that hidden influence becomes the answer to the central question. Why did Scripture remember this mysterious father-in-law at all? Because Jethro did something few people around Moses were able to do. He helped the deliverer of Israel understand that leadership was not the same as carrying the entire nation by himself. By the time Jethro reaches Moses' camp, the world around Moses has changed completely. The fugitive of Midian is gone. In his place stands the man who confronted Pharaoh, led Israel through the sea, and became the visible human leader of a newly liberated people. But Jethro sees something beneath the transformation. He sees that Moses is carrying too much. That observation brings us to the central question of this story. Who was Jethro really? And why did this mysterious father-in-law matter so much in the life of Moses? The strongest answer is not hidden in a lost document. It is not preserved in a later legend. It does not require us to solve every debate surrounding Reuel, Hobab, Midian, or the Kenites. The answer is already in Exodus. Jethro was one of the people who stood beside Moses at the exact moments when Moses was being forced to become someone new. When Moses fled Egypt, Jethro's household gave him refuge. When Moses had lost his place in the world he knew, Jethro's family gave him another place to belong. When Moses became a shepherd, he tended Jethro's flock. When Moses was called back to Egypt, he returned to Jethro before leaving. When Moses' wife and sons were separated from him during the larger crisis surrounding the Exodus, Jethro later brought them back. And when Moses began carrying the weight of an entire people in a way that could not continue, Jethro spoke. That pattern is the main payoff. Jethro did not create Moses' calling. God did. Jethro did not deliver Israel. God acted through Moses and Aaron. Jethro did not give Israel the covenant at Sinai. The biblical narrative presents that revelation as coming from God. Jethro did not replace Moses. He never tried to. What he did was quieter. He helped preserve the man who had been called to lead. That distinction matters. Because history often remembers the person standing in front. It remembers the king, the prophet, the commander, the reformer, the public voice. But public leadership is almost never formed in isolation. Behind nearly every visible figure stand people who shelter, advise, challenge, teach, correct, or simply make survival possible. Jethro is one of those people in the story of Moses. He is not the hero of the Exodus, but he is part of the human structure that allowed the hero of the Exodus to endure. And nowhere is that clearer than in the leadership crisis of Exodus 18. Moses is judging the people alone, from morning until evening. The entire community depends on his ability to hear cases. Jethro watches. Then he identifies the danger. Moses will wear himself out. The people will wear themselves out. The task is too heavy. The solution is not for Moses to abandon responsibility. The solution is to redefine responsibility. This is the key. Moses must keep the responsibilities that belong uniquely to his calling. He must represent the people before God. He must teach them God's instructions. He must show them the way they should live. But he must stop behaving as though every dispute requires his personal intervention. So Jethro tells him to find trustworthy leaders, capable men, men who fear God, men who reject dishonest gain. Give them real responsibility. Let ordinary disputes be handled at lower levels. Bring the most difficult matters upward. The result is a system in which the burden is shared, and Moses does it. That response may be even more important than the advice itself. Moses listens to his father-in-law. This is a man who has already faced Pharaoh, a man through whom signs and wonders have occurred, a man followed by an entire people, a man whose authority is unlike that of anyone else in Israel. Yet Moses remains teachable. There is no recorded argument, no defensive speech, no insistence that divine calling means his method cannot be questioned. He listens. He changes. That is a character revelation, and it may explain why Jethro belongs in the story. Jethro does not merely give us information about Moses' family. He reveals something about Moses himself. The greatest leader in Israel at that moment is still capable of learning from someone else, even from someone outside Israel, even from a priest of Midian. That makes the scene far more than a lesson in management. It becomes a lesson in authority. Power that cannot receive correction becomes dangerous. Authority that depends entirely on one person becomes fragile. Leadership that refuses to share responsibility eventually exhausts both the leader and the people. Jethro sees all three dangers at once, and the Bible preserves his warning. That is why the line remains so memorable. What you are doing is not good. Few people in Moses' story can say something like that to him and be heard. Jethro can. Why? Because he is not competing for Moses' position. He has nothing to gain from weakening him. He is family. He has history with him. He knew Moses before Moses became powerful. He had seen Moses when Moses needed help. That gives Jethro a kind of freedom others around Moses may not have had. He can look beyond Moses' status. He can see the man carrying the status. And that may be why he recognizes the danger so quickly. To the people, Moses may have seemed indispensable. To Jethro, Moses is still human. That is the heart of the relationship. Jethro never confuses Moses' calling with Moses' capacity. And Moses never seems to interpret Jethro's correction as disrespect for his calling. Those two perspectives meet. The result is change. This is where the story of Jethro becomes larger than one family relationship. It shows that biblical leadership does not erase human limits. Calling does not eliminate exhaustion. Responsibility does not require isolation. And wisdom does not always come from the person with the most famous name. Sometimes wisdom comes from the person who arrives from outside the system and sees the problem everyone inside has learned to accept. Jethro is that outsider. He enters Israel's camp without Moses' authority, without Aaron's priestly role, without tribal position among the Israelites. Yet he sees clearly. That perspective is one reason his Midianite identity matters. The text does not hide it. Again and again he is connected to Midian. The narrative could simply have called him Moses' relative. It could have minimized his foreignness. Instead, it preserves it. The priest of Midian blesses the Lord. The priest of Midian shares a meal with Israel's elders. The priest of Midian advises Israel's leader. The leader listens. For viewers who expect the biblical story always to divide neatly between insiders who possess wisdom and outsiders who possess none, Jethro becomes a complication. The text is more nuanced. Jethro stands outside Israel's tribal identity, yet he can recognize what God has done. He can rejoice in Israel's deliverance. He can speak wisely. And Moses can receive that wisdom without surrendering the uniqueness of his own calling. That is an important balance. The story does not make all religious systems equal. It does not blur the identity of Israel's God. Jethro himself praises the Lord because of what the Lord has done. But neither does the story assume that being outside Israel makes a person incapable of insight. That is part of why Jethro remains such a fascinating figure. He belongs near the boundary, near enough to Israel to become family, far enough away to remain distinct, near enough to worship with Israel's leaders, far enough away that his exact religious identity still raises questions, near enough to advise Moses, far enough away that he does not become part of Moses' permanent leadership structure. Then he leaves. This departure is important because it clarifies his role. Jethro does not remain to control the system he recommended. He does not appoint himself over the newly chosen leaders. He does not use his advice to claim authority inside Israel. He gives counsel. Moses acts. Jethro returns home. That makes his intervention unusually clean. No obvious political ambition, no recorded demand for reward, no attempt to transform influence into office. His contribution remains counsel. And perhaps that is one reason it could be received so freely. Jethro could see the problem because he was not trapped inside the structure. And he could leave after speaking because he did not need to own the solution. There is something worth noticing here. The people chosen under the new structure are not selected simply because they are skilled administrators. Their character matters. Jethro's model assumes that delegated authority can solve one problem while creating another if the people receiving that authority are corrupt. So he emphasizes trustworthiness, fear of God, hatred of dishonest gain. Responsibility must be distributed, but moral accountability cannot be discarded. That is another reason the advice deserves more than a passing mention. Jethro is not merely reducing Moses' workload. He is proposing a network of trustworthy authority. The burden becomes shared without becoming careless. And that principle becomes essential for a people learning how to live together outside Egypt. The moment also exposes a deeper transition in Israel's identity. Under slavery, Pharaoh's system decided the shape of daily life. Egyptian overseers imposed labor. Egyptian power dominated disputes. Egyptian structures controlled movement. Now those structures are gone. Freedom creates responsibility. Israel must become more than a crowd of escaped slaves. They must learn how to function as a people. That requires institutions, judgment, trusted leadership, standards, shared responsibility. The Exodus removed Pharaoh. It did not remove the need for order, and Jethro's advice enters at precisely that threshold. That is why the timing of his appearance matters. He does not give this counsel while Moses is still hiding in Midian. There would be no nation to organize. He does not give it while Moses is confronting Pharaoh. The immediate struggle is liberation. He gives it after deliverance, when a new kind of leadership crisis has emerged. Jethro is a transitional figure because he appears when the nature of Moses' burden changes. First, Moses needs shelter. Later, he needs structure. Jethro is present for both. And that may be the simplest way to understand his significance. Jethro meets Moses twice at moments when Moses cannot continue in the same way he has been living. The first time, Moses cannot continue as an Egyptian insider. His old life has collapsed. Jethro's household becomes part of the transition. The second time, Moses cannot continue as a solitary decision-maker for an entire people. His leadership method is unsustainable. Jethro's counsel becomes part of the transition. In both cases, Jethro does not determine Moses' destiny. He helps Moses cross into the next stage. That is hidden influence. And hidden influence often looks small in the moment. An invitation to eat, permission to leave, a family brought back together, a question asked after a long day, a sentence of correction, a practical plan. None of those events look as spectacular as the Red Sea, but spectacle and consequence are not the same thing. The sea crossing saves Israel from Pharaoh's army. Jethro's counsel helps Moses avoid becoming crushed by the daily burden of the people he has saved. Both matter in different ways. This is also why the title father-in-law should not make Jethro seem less important. Family relationships are often where biblical history turns quietly. A father-in-law can become a refuge. A wife can save a life. A brother can become a spokesman. A sister can help preserve an infant. A son can carry a legacy. Scripture often places enormous consequences inside relationships that look secondary to the main public event. Jethro belongs to that pattern. His greatness, if we can use that word carefully, is not greatness of fame. It is greatness of placement. He appears where his presence matters. Then he disappears before the spotlight can settle on him. This helps answer another question. Why does Scripture preserve Jethro's name at all? Because his role is not interchangeable. The narrative wants us to know that Moses did not invent every solution alone. It wants us to remember that an outsider gave useful counsel. It wants us to see Moses receiving that counsel. It preserves the relationship because the relationship changes the shape of the story. That is enough. We do not need secret manuscripts. We do not need conspiracy theories. We do not need to declare Jethro the hidden mastermind behind Moses. The biblical account is already more compelling than that. A forgotten priest in Midian opens his household to a fugitive. Years later, that fugitive becomes the leader of Israel. Then the priest visits him, watches him for a single day, and immediately recognizes something that could destroy him. He speaks. Moses listens. The burden changes. That is the story behind the story, and it leads to one final question. What remains after Jethro leaves? Not simply what happened to him personally. Scripture does not give us a final biography. The more important question is what his relationship leaves behind. His daughter remains tied to Moses. His grandsons carry Moses' family line. Midianite and Kenite connections continue surfacing in later biblical history. And perhaps most importantly, the lesson Jethro embodied remains visible in Moses' later life. A leader does not have to be alone to be faithful. The presence of other capable people is not a threat to authority. It can be the thing that makes authority sustainable. Jethro disappears, but that principle does not. And when we follow the family he leaves behind, another strange silence begins to emerge. Moses becomes one of the greatest names in the Bible, but his own sons nearly vanish from the story. Gershom, Eleazar, the grandsons of Jethro, the children of the man who led a nation. They are there, and then compared with their father, they almost disappear. Which raises the next untold question. What happened to the family of Moses after the Exodus Jethro leaves? And Scripture does not tell us how he died. It does not tell us how many years he lived after departing from Moses. It does not give us a final conversation between father-in-law and son-in-law. There is no scene in which Moses returns to Midian to stand beside Jethro at the end of his life. There is no recorded blessing over the family, no final prophecy, no carefully preserved last words. For a man who appeared at such important moments, the ending is remarkably quiet. But perhaps that is appropriate, because Jethro's story was never about how long he remained visible. It was about what remained after he was gone. And what remained was more than one piece of advice. His legacy lived in people, in relationships, in decisions, in the way Moses learned to carry authority, and in a family line that continued to hover near the edges of Israel's story long after Jethro himself disappeared from the page. The first part of that legacy is Zipporah. She had been Jethro's daughter before she became Moses' wife. Her story cannot be separated from Midian. She belongs to the years when Moses was hidden from Egypt. She was there before the confrontation with Pharaoh, before the sea, before Sinai. And because of her, Jethro's household became permanently linked to the family of Moses. That connection produced two sons, Gershom, Eleazar. The names themselves preserve memory. Gershom is connected to Moses' sense of being a foreigner in another land. Eleazar is connected to the confession that the God of Moses' father had been his help and had delivered him from Pharaoh's sword. Those names hold the story of exile and rescue inside the family. One son remembers displacement, the other remembers deliverance. Together they stand as quiet witnesses to the years between Moses' failure in Egypt and his return as Israel's leader. And through them, Jethro was not merely Moses' father-in-law. He was the grandfather of Moses' sons. That matters because those sons create another one of Scripture's great silences. Moses becomes one of the dominant figures in the Bible. His brother Aaron becomes the ancestor of Israel's priestly line. Joshua becomes Moses' successor. But Gershom and Eleazar do not inherit Moses' public leadership in any comparable way. There is no dynasty of Moses ruling Israel. There is no simple succession in which the son of the great leader becomes the next great leader. That absence is striking. It suggests something about the nature of Moses' role. His calling is not treated as private family property. His authority does not automatically pass to his sons. Joshua is chosen to lead after Moses, not Gershom or Eleazar. Aaron's priestly line develops in one direction. Moses' descendants move in another, and Jethro's family connection therefore becomes part of a fascinating contrast. Through marriage, Jethro enters the household of the man who will lead Israel, yet his grandchildren do not become princes. The story refuses the logic of hereditary political greatness. That itself becomes part of the aftermath. Moses' public legacy belongs to Israel. His family legacy becomes much quieter. And the family from Midian remains close to the story without taking possession of it. There are later references to descendants connected to Moses, but the biblical record is sparse, and some passages raise difficult textual questions. We should be careful here. It would be easy to create an elaborate dynasty from fragments. The text does not allow that. What it does allow us to see is that Moses had descendants, that those descendants continued, and that their later history did not mirror Moses' own fame. Once again, the famous story moves forward, while the family story becomes hidden. That is why the natural next untold story is not another miracle. It is the question left behind by Moses' own household. What happened to his sons? But Jethro's legacy also appears through another family connection. The Kenites. Later biblical texts associate the Kenites with Moses' relatives by marriage. In Judges, we are told that descendants or members of the Kenite family connected to Moses' father-in-law traveled with Judah and settled among the people. This is important because it shows that the relationship formed in Midian did not simply vanish when Jethro returned home. Some branch of that wider kinship network continued interacting with Israel. They lived near Israel. They moved among Israel. They became part of later biblical events. Again, we should resist oversimplifying the relationship. The terms Midianite and Kenite are not interchangeable in every biblical context. The exact genealogy is not always clear. Ancient clan identities could overlap, shift, or be described from different perspectives. But the biblical association between Moses' family by marriage and the Kenites is strong enough that later writers assume the reader can recognize it. Then comes one of the most dramatic examples, Jael. During the period of the Judges, Israel suffers under the power of Jabin, king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera. Deborah serves as judge. Barak leads Israelite forces. The battle turns against Sisera. He flees, and he enters the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. Sisera expects safety. He does not find it. Jael kills him. The victory song that follows celebrates her action. This does not mean Jethro directly planned some future alliance generations earlier. It does not mean we can trace every step of Jael's ancestry confidently back to Jethro as an individual. That would go beyond the evidence. But the Kenite connection matters. A group linked in the biblical memory to Moses' Midianite relatives remains near Israel long enough to appear in one of the most famous victories of the book of Judges. The household that once received a fugitive continues casting a shadow far beyond the well in Midian. That is legacy. Not always direct, not always simple, but real. There is another later moment involving Kenites that deepens the picture. During the reign of Saul, before an attack on the Amalekites, Saul warns the Kenites to separate themselves so they will not be destroyed with Amalek. Why? Because according to the text, they had shown kindness to the Israelites when Israel came up from Egypt. That memory is significant. Generations later, kindness shown during Israel's early journey is still remembered. The precise relationship between that statement and Jethro's personal actions should not be exaggerated, but the larger pattern is clear. Some communities connected with Moses' relatives by marriage maintained a distinct and often favorable relationship with Israel. Hospitality had consequences. Kindness had memory. Relationships created in the wilderness outlived the generation that formed them. And that brings us back to the beginning. Moses arrived in Midian with almost nothing. He had lost status, he had lost security, he had lost his place in Egypt. At a well, he defended several women. Their father invited him to eat. That invitation became a home. The home became a marriage. The marriage became a family. The family became part of Moses' hidden years. And the head of that household eventually became one of Moses' most trusted voices. What looked like a random stop in the wilderness became part of the architecture of Moses' life. That is what makes Jethro's story powerful. Not spectacle, placement. Jethro stands at the places where one chapter of Moses' life becomes another. When Moses is between Egypt and purpose, Jethro receives him. When Moses is between shepherding and mission, Jethro releases him. When Moses is between family separation and reunion, Jethro brings Zipporah and the sons. When Moses is between heroic leadership and unsustainable leadership, Jethro corrects him. Then he leaves. Few characters in Scripture accomplish so much with so little narrative space, and that is perhaps the clearest reason the Bible preserves him. Being briefly mentioned does not mean being unimportant. Sometimes Scripture places a person beside the central figure only long enough to alter the direction of the story. Jethro is one of those people. His influence also forces us to reconsider how we imagine Moses. We tend to remember Moses as solitary, standing alone before Pharaoh, standing alone with the staff over the sea, climbing the mountain, receiving the law, interceding for Israel. Those images are real, but they can create an incomplete portrait. Moses was surrounded by relationships. Aaron spoke beside him. Miriam stood within his family story. Joshua served and succeeded him. The elders carried responsibility. Zipporah stood inside one of the most difficult episodes of his early mission. And Jethro gave him something different from all of them: perspective. Jethro had known Moses before Moses became a symbol, before Israel looked at him as deliverer, before Pharaoh looked at him as an enemy, before later generations called him prophet and lawgiver. Jethro knew the fugitive, the shepherd, the son-in-law. That history may explain why he could speak to Moses without being overwhelmed by the legend forming around him. To Jethro, the man who had confronted Pharaoh was still the man who could become exhausted, still a husband, still a father, still a human being. And that is why the warning matters. You will surely wear yourself out. Moses needed someone who could say that. Many leaders need people who can say that. Not people who flatter, not people who compete. People close enough to recognize danger and secure enough to speak. That may be Jethro's most enduring human legacy. He was willing to tell Moses the truth, and Moses was willing to hear it. Neither half should be forgotten. Advice without humility is wasted. Humility without honest counsel remains blind. In Exodus 18, the two meet. Jethro speaks, Moses listens. The system changes. That is the narrative payoff. The character payoff goes deeper. Jethro represents the kind of hidden figure Scripture preserves because history does not move only through the people standing in the center. Sometimes it moves through the person who provides refuge, the person who opens a home, the person who sees a problem, the person who says one necessary sentence, the person who disappears afterward. The biblical payoff is equally important. Jethro's presence reminds us that God's work in the Exodus story is larger than one human personality. Moses is central, but Moses is not sufficient by himself. He needs Aaron, he needs elders, he needs Joshua, he needs people capable of judging. And at one crucial moment, he needs a Midianite father-in-law to show him what everyone else has apparently accepted as normal. This does not diminish Moses. It makes his story more human and perhaps more credible, because one of the strongest qualities Scripture gives Moses is not that he always knows everything. It is that he can respond when truth comes from somewhere unexpected. Jethro's advice is not accepted because Jethro outranks Moses. He does not. It is accepted because it is wise. That is an important distinction. Truth does not become false because the speaker stands outside the center. Wisdom does not become useless because it comes from an unexpected person. Moses can discern, receive, and act, and Jethro can speak without needing to become the hero. Their relationship, therefore, gives us one of the quietest lessons in the Exodus. Great missions still require relationships. Divine calling still operates through human communities. And sometimes the person who helps a leader continue is someone history barely remembers. Jethro was not at the Red Sea when Moses stretched out his hand in the way viewers remember the scene. He was not standing beside Moses on Sinai when the covenant was given. He did not lead Israel into Canaan. He never became the face of the story. But he was there before much of it began, and he came back when Moses needed him again. That is enough to change the way we see him. The mysterious father-in-law was not merely attached to Moses through marriage. He was part of the hidden scaffolding of Moses' life. A priest of Midian who became family. A host who received a fugitive. A father who gave his daughter in marriage. A man whose flock was tended by the future leader of Israel. A witness who rejoiced at Israel's deliverance. A worshiper who blessed the Lord. An advisor who saw a leadership crisis. A voice Moses respected enough to obey. Then a man who stepped out of the story. And perhaps that last detail is the most fitting of all. Jethro did not need to remain visible for his influence to remain real. The best counsel often outlives the conversation that produced it. The strongest relationships sometimes leave their mark after the people themselves have gone. And the Bible, for all its great kings, prophets, warriors, and miracles, repeatedly reminds us that history can turn through people who occupy only a few verses. Jethro is one of them. But his disappearance opens another mystery, because Jethro's daughter was still Moses' wife. His grandsons were still Moses' sons. And while Moses became one of the most famous men in the biblical world, the family closest to him almost disappeared from the record. Gershom and Eleazar never became another Moses. Their descendants did not inherit their father's public place. And the silence around them is almost as mysterious as the silence around Jethro. So the next time we return to Moses, we will not follow him back to Pharaoh. We will follow the family that history left behind. Because the man who led an entire nation had sons of his own. And their untold story is only beginning.